led the way in everything. In 1945, when the guns fell silent, the world was bankrupt and exhausted. Across 3 decades in which empires crumbled, new players with new ideologies emerged. A world centuries in the making had been dismantled by a world war. On November 3, 1943, Führer's Directive Number 51 warned, "A greater danger now appears in the West, an Anglo-Saxon landing." A year later, those Anglo-Saxons were advancing on the Rhine. The Soviet army had smashed through Army Group Center, and the Allies were waging a tough but successful war in the Pacific. Every precedent of warfare encouraged the belief that the certainty of defeat would bring overtures for peace from the Germans, as it had in 1918. But this was not 1918. The Führer ruled there would be no surrender. There would be victory, or there would be total destruction. Operation Husky put 115,000 British and 66,000 American troops ashore in Sicily to face over 300,000 Axis troops.
It was known that Mussolini's regime was wavering, and during the course of the battle on Sicily, Mussolini himself was deposed. The Axis was falling apart.
2 weeks after the landing, the fascist Grand Council voted 19-8 for the removal of Mussolini. Italy's new foreign minister gave the German ambassador his word of honor that Italy was not negotiating with the Allies. But with Mussolini out of favor, the Italians knew Allied domination was imminent.
The government that replaced Mussolini were looking to get out of the Axis, make what accommodation they could with the Allies under very, very difficult circumstances. At the time, the Allies were bringing pressure on Italy through their strategic bombing of the Italian mainland. So the idea was, if you invade Sicily, you would bring pressure on what was perceived to be the weak link in the Axis, and very importantly, it would demonstrate to the Soviet Union, Stalin's Soviet Union, that had been involved in a major war against the Germans since 1941, that the Western Allies were making meaningful progress to relieve the pressure on them.
The campaign that fought its way up the length of Italy against a tenacious and well-organized German defense was a cruel and bitter affair which did not decide the war. As Rome was being liberated, an Allied armada closed on the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord would combine the efforts of 8,000 aircraft, 1,200 warships, and nearly 3 million men in landing 133,000 soldiers, their tanks and vehicles, on an 80-kilometer stretch of Normandy coastline in a single day.
By the time of Operation Overlord, the Luftwaffe had effectively been swept out of the skies of Western Europe. The Allies had complete air supremacy.
Late on June 5th, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, gave the go-ahead. "I hope to God I know what I'm doing," he said.
Whilst the Germans were quite innovative in the early stages of the Second World War in military terms by the use of tanks and air force, in the later parts of the Second World War, they fall back to World War I fighting in static positions, and the Atlantic Wall is one symbol of that. Prior to D-Day, Nazi propaganda had told the German people and the military that this is going to be the decisive battle of the war. Germany had suffered a lot of defeats on the Eastern Front, but they still hoped if they ward off an Allied invasion in Western Europe, they could redeploy their forces and then turn it against the Soviet Union again. However, it very quickly turns out, after the 6th of June 1944, that the Germans are just outnumbered and outgunned in the Normandy battle.
On June 9th, as the Allies consolidated the Normandy beachhead, Stalin told the British Prime Minister, "Tomorrow we begin the first round on the Leningrad front." The Soviet Union, so close to defeat in 1941, was about to drive the invader from its soil. The price it had paid was immense. Soviet vengeance would be terrible. On May 12th, Georgy Zhukov, now promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union, said, "It is necessary to prepare an operation that will be like an earthquake." Bagration was that earthquake.
There is no other offensive in 1944 that can equal Operation Bagration. And it will become the quintessential Soviet operation of the Second World War. And this is partly because operational art for the Soviets doesn't actually begin with battle. It begins with something called Moskarovka, and that is deception or camouflage, and the Germans don't know it's coming.
On June 22nd, Operation Bagration sent 166 Soviet divisions against 37 German divisions and simply pulverized the German center.
And this led to the collapse of German Army Group Center. The Germans lose hundreds of thousands of men, either being killed or taken prisoner by the Soviets.
By mid-August, Soviet forces stood on the line of the rivers Vistula and Narev. Engineers threw bridgeheads across, and there the situation froze for 5 months.
Something like 57,000 POWs from Army Group Center are taken to Moscow and are then paraded through the streets. There are 19 German generals, there are 1,000 officers, and it's in many cases the first time everyday Muscovites have had the opportunity to sit here and watch Germans defeated, unwashed, parading through their city. It's the quintessential image of Soviet victory.
The Soviets did not drive for the heart of Germany. On Stalin's orders, they advanced instead to stake out an empire and create the division that would color world affairs until the Soviet Union unraveled more than 40 years later. I have made a momentous decision. I shall go over to the offensive, Hitler announced on September 16th. His plan, he said, was to come out of the Ardennes with the objective, Antwerp. On the morning of December 16th, the 145-kilometer front was held by 4 American divisions, with 1 inexperienced armored division in support. 2 of the infantry divisions had been sent to the quiet Ardennes to recuperate, and 1, the 106th, had never been in action. It was onto this force that 2 panzer armies fell, initiating the Battle of the Bulge. In our present situation, Jodl, chief of the operations staff, said, "We can't shrink from risking everything on one card." The Germans relied on dirty weather to ground Allied air superiority, and they got it. But the weather cleared, and the Americans got to work. In early January, they began a counter-offensive that would lead to large German casualties and withdrawal. In February and March, Eisenhower's armies advanced along the entire front. By the end of the first week of March, only the River Rhine delayed their pouring into the fatherland. Soviet boots were already on German soil, and as they advanced, they began their vengeful rampage. The tide was turning. And Hitler's popularity, long held throughout Germany, was unraveling. By early 1945, support for the Führer and the Nazi Party existed only among the diehards. Violence and intimidation cowed people who saw their neighbors strung up from lampposts with placards around their necks.
If you are not fighting for the regime, you are an enemy, whether you are a foreign citizen or a German. This is why they will hang their own soldiers, this is why they will mistreat their own people, just as they did foreign peoples. It speaks to the nature of National Socialism and the kind of army Hitler has forged after 13 years in power.
A shared sense of complicity in crime was a further factor holding the echelons of the Nazi power structure together. In Japan, too, talk of surrender could get you arrested. In 1945, more than 400 people were arrested there on suspicion of favoring peace negotiations.
As early as the fall of Saipan in July 1944, it's pretty clear by that point that the war is over. And in fact, There are various admirals in Tokyo who are saying precisely that the war's lost.
General Tojo had lost the support of the emperor, and on January 21st, his successor as prime minister admitted to the Diet that military developments in the Pacific theater are in a state which does not necessarily admit of optimism.
The Japanese Supreme Council for the Direction of the War was becoming frantic. The war in China was a stalemate. The war in Burma was a stalemate. And the war in the Pacific, they were losing. They were being defeated by major naval offensives in the Central, South, and Southwest Pacific.
But what did most to destroy Japanese optimism was not defeat in her far-flung empire, but the devastation being endured by the home islands. The Japanese populace was starving, and their situation was about to get much, much worse. The US was shoring up bases in the Pacific, and that, along with their new B-29 long-range bomber, changed the way they were able to wage war in the skies.
And it wasn't until 1944 that the Americans acquired bases they could use effectively in the Mariana Islands to target Japan. And even then, it was only because they designed very rapid pace the B-29 long-range bombers. The aircraft was flawed in a number of ways, despite the fact that they spent more on designing and building the B-29 fleet than they had to spend on the atomic bomb.
The raid launched against Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th involved 325 B-29 superfortresses.
The moment the Americans took Saipan, it gave them a base from which their bombers could fly from Saipan over Japan, drop their payloads, destroy a Japanese city, and then turn around and land back on Saipan.
Almost 25 square kilometers of central Tokyo, 250,000 buildings, were destroyed.
Does the bombing particularly affect the outcome of the war or Japan's war effort? Probably not as much as we imagine. Does it affect, in terms of the civilian casualties, does it change Japan's leadership's thinking? Not a great deal, not a great deal. There's a perception that the emperor and the Japanese state is more important than the individuals, and so those civilian casualties, although considered to be appalling and awful, are not in and of themselves enough to force Japan into considering surrender.
While the US were bombing Japanese targets, the British were repaying the favor in Germany. In 1945, the RAF were relentless. Germany was bombed day and night against less and less effective air defenses. Half of the German civilians killed in air raids lost their lives in the last 4 months of the war. Yet Hitler continued to feed his propaganda machine. On April 16th, 2 weeks before his suicide, Hitler described the assault by Soviet forces in deluded terms. For the last time, he said, the Jewish Bolshevik deadly foe has come forth with his masses to attack. he was quite right about one thing. The masses were right on his doorstep. In early 1945, the Soviet forces were marching from the east, and by mid-April, the Allies advancing from the west and taking prisoners at a rate of 50,000 each day. Many walking into their arms to avoid capture by the Red Army, which, by April 25th, had encircled Berlin.
German failure in the Soviet Union is a reflection of its hubris. It isn't just a war and the military miscalculations that are replete throughout this war, but it's also the political dimension that we need to look at. The miscalculation, the whole idea of Lebensraum, the overblown concepts of what was possible in the East.
On the 26th, Soviet troops, supported by 12,700 guns, 21,000 rocket launchers, and 1,500 tanks, stood ready for the final assault of the war against Hitler. By the 27th, the area of Berlin, still in German hands, was only 16 kilometers long and less than 5 kilometers wide. And Hitler? He was hiding with his partner Eva Braun in the Führer bunker in Berlin. And he had been underground for months. On April 29th, with Berlin hanging by a thread, Adolf Hitler dictated his final testament and married Eva Braun. On April 30th, Hitler had lunch, poisoned his dog, and then killed himself.
But there were a number of other factors in April that I think fully convinced him that the only way out was to take his own life. One of those factors was that the military situation around Berlin was far worse than he had been willing to accept. There was simply no way of stopping the Red Army, which was closing in on the bunker complex in central Berlin.
I think the quintessential act that leads to German surrender is Adolf Hitler's death. It's impossible to understand a Nazi state without Hitler, because National Socialism is indistinguishable from Hitler. And once he is gone, there are two things that are no longer there. There's no natural leader, and there is no real sense to continue fighting.
German generals began to surrender one by one. And by the 8th of May, Field Marshal Keitel signed the surrender document for the German army in front of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov.
And Stalin demanded extraordinary sacrifices of the population that justifies everything. We won. There's a medal that everyone got who participated, and it says, "Наше дело правое, мы победили," which translates as, our approach was the correct one because we won.
On the 9th, Hermann Goering was captured by members of the US 7th Army. The war, though not the fighting, in Europe was over. And the last act of the Pacific War had begun. In late 1944, Admiral King, chief of U.S. naval operations, met with his counterparts in San Francisco. They agreed to make Okinawa the principal target for amphibious landings in the year ahead. To establish air superiority, it was also agreed that a nearby, much smaller island should also be taken. This was Iwo Jima, where landings commenced on February 19th.
So the idea is if we can capture Iwo Jima, it'll perform two functions. First, the radar station there and any fighters that are stationed there will be eliminated. So the warnings that Iwo Jima is sending to mainland Japan of the bombing attacks of the strategic bombing campaign by the Four Eastern Air Forces, those will go away. The second thing is you capture the airfield on Iwo Jima, and it can become what we call a divert airfield for damaged B-29s.
A third of those who landed were either wounded or killed. Those who opposed them, 21,000 Japanese, were killed almost to a man.
People are still arguing whether we needed to seize it or not. Could we have avoided all those casualties? But the people who say it was a must-seize were the Army Air Forces and the Combined Chiefs of Staff.
Then, April 5th, a formal Soviet note advised Tokyo that the Japanese-Soviet Neutrality Pact, signed in 1941, was about to expire and would not be renewed. The pressure was building, and the Japanese had a massive battle to come: Okinawa.
The invasion of Okinawa was one of the precursor operations to the invasion of Japan. It needed to be seized for two reasons: airfields, anchorages. So we're going to build airfields to provide bases to cover the invasion of the main Japanese islands of Kyushu and Honshu, and then we'll have the anchorages that we can base all the invasion shipping.
By nightfall, more than 60,000 Americans were ashore. Resistance was slight, casualties few, and the defensive line had been set inland. The Japanese had fared much, much worse.
The Japanese have already shown that casualties really don't matter to them. The Japanese generals who are running the war at this point in 1944 have already decided to sacrifice every man, woman, and child in Japan to prevent an invasion of Japan, which they know is coming.
Okinawa, controlled by Japan since 1895, was defended by the 100,000-strong 32nd Army of General Ushijima Mitsuru. But when the battle concluded, he committed suicide. Virtually his entire command, as well as tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians, were dead.
The Japanese decision to defend it was a decisive battle campaign. We will defeat the Americans in such a bloody campaign in Okinawa with kamikazes and defenses ashore that the Americans will realize that this is too hard.
But despite huge losses on each side, the US weren't backing down. And neither were the Japanese. On June 6th, with rumors of peace swirling, Japanese Supreme Command released a document, the fundamental policy to be followed henceforth in the conduct of the war. It declared that the Japanese were to protect their national essence at all costs. The final battle on Japanese soil was expected to cause the deaths of 20 million Japanese, whose weapons, the service chiefs admitted, would include bows, arrows, and bamboo spears.
The people are literally on the verge of starvation. You've got no industry left. You've got no ships left. So even if you had industry, you have no way of bringing any kind of raw material, say rubber from Malaya or something, that you could turn into a car type. None of this is happening. So that there's not a lot left in Japan.
But with casualties running high and time running out, the Americans had tested a new weapon. new era of warfare was about to begin. The use of an atomic bomb would change the course of history forever. And the decision to use it rested with President Truman, who had taken office following FDR's death. Truman believed the bomb would bring the war to a speedy end.
Hiroshima is chosen because it's a military target. It is the center of where the Japanese are going to command and control for the invasion of Japan.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold.
If radiation deaths are included, a combined figure of 160 to 200,000 is a plausible death toll caused by the bombing of Hiroshima.
Later that night, the Soviet Union withdraws its diplomatic delegation and breaks off formal relations with Japan. A couple hours after that, the Soviets invade Manchuria with 3 mechanized army groups that they've moved, almost 3 months to the day that Stalin said he would attack. So Stalin keeps his promise. So now the Soviets are in the war.
With unspeakable scenes of death and distress in Hiroshima, the Allies waited for the unconditional surrender of the Japanese. But still, it did not come.
So the decision is made when the Japanese don't respond after 2 days of the Hiroshima bombing to drop the Nagasaki bomb. This is a plutonium bomb. It's the horriblest bomb human beings had ever invented.
But this atrocious action had the requisite response. And on August 15th, the Japanese emperor addressed his people. His voice, which most Japanese had never heard, told the listeners, "We are resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable."
Arrangements are now being made for the formal signing of the surrender terms at the earliest possible moment. General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander.
Japan was defeated. Her cities laid waste. Germany was beaten, occupied, and all but destroyed. Dictating peace terms posed no difficulties. But making peace, that proved to be a challenge beyond the competence of the disintegrating Grand Alliance. Countries that had been liberated looked for scapegoats and distortions. Some still do. Some individuals had to bear special guilt, and instead of the war guilt clause that had caused such resentment in 1919, faced war crimes trials. Hitler's henchmen came first. 10 were hanged, and Hermann Goering committed suicide. 11 corpses were taken to Dachau concentration camp and burned in the ovens that had sent so many victims up in smoke. Their ashes were then scattered in the Isar River. There was to be no place of pilgrimage. But the neatness of trial and punishment did not settle the issues that had been battled over since 1914, the issues of border and nationality. The peacemakers of 1919 had drawn new boundaries to replace those of collapsed imperial regimes, hoping to satisfy the continent's ethnic divisions. The peacemakers of 1945 were, by and large, satisfied to leave the boundaries as they were and settle the challenge of ethnic minorities through the forced redistribution of people.
Approximately 10 million Germans either fled or were expelled from Eastern Europe to the German territories. In some cases, they were expelled also from territories that up until the Second World War had been German, but were now being taken from Germany to be given to Russia or to Poland.
By the end of the war, there were 60 million displaced persons, uprooted by Nazi policies, Allied decisions, or Soviet government action.
There was this massive redrawing of the populations of Europe, and it's one that occurred at the hands of the new communist and socialist governments of Eastern Europe, but with the full awareness and acceptance of Britain and the United States.
As millions of Germans were being sent west, 5 million Soviet citizens, prisoners of war, slave laborers, and some who had fought with the Germans were transplanted east. With the Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri barely complete, the problem the old colonial powers in Asia confronted was the resistance to the resumption of their rule. Europe wanted somehow to go back to normal, but in Asia, nothing would be the same again. And empire, once at the core of imperial power in Europe, would diminish almost immediately.
Japan's war in Southeast Asia, aside from the fact that the Japanese physically removed the British, the Dutch, the French from their colonies, there was an aura of power that those British colonial Dutch colonial, French colonial authorities maintained down the decades. And the Japanese shattered that aura of power and invincibility. Wartime propaganda emphasized notions like Asia for the Asians, and independence movements throughout Southeast Asia took on these concepts with a real gusto.
By 1945, despite what French and British elites continued to believe, they were no longer in a position to hold on to their colonial territories in the Middle Eastern region. Pretty soon, from 1943 onwards, we begin to see a wave of independence moments for nation-states around the region.
On August 16th, 1945, the day after the Japanese emperor told his subjects to lay down their arms, a provisional government was formed in Hanoi, headed by a revolutionary named Nguyen That Thanh, who took the name Ho Chi Minh, he who enlightens. In Jakarta, on August 17th, a man named Sukarno read a short speech to a waiting crowd. "We, the people of Indonesia," he read, "hereby declare Indonesia's independence." In India, a few minutes before midnight on August 14th, 1947, the Prime Minister-designate got to his feet in the Parliament. At the stroke of the midnight hour, Jawaharlal Nehru said, "While the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom." And countries in the Middle East were following their Asian neighbors.
So this is a really important and primary effect of the Second World War. It fatally weakened the French and British ability to maintain formal imperial power in the region.
In the immediate post-war aftermath, the Middle East was dominated by the foundation of the State of Israel. Britain, unable and unwilling to effect more change, turned to the newly formed United Nations.
The UN, in turn, decided to try to create a state which was going to be a binational state, and this provoked an explosion of civil war between the Zionists and the Palestinian nationalist movement in 1948. And that civil war immediately became an international war as Arab nations joined in on the side of the Palestinian nationalist movement. The Zionists were successful in this war in 1948, created the State of Israel. So the Arab defeat in 1948 didn't just have consequences for the Palestinians, it also had major consequences for the Arab countries that had gotten involved and been defeated by the Israeli forces in that war.
In a certain sense, if you look at a long sweep of history, all roads lead to the Second World War and all roads lead away from it. We still live in a world on which the roads lead away from World War II in terms of how we think about international politics, how we think about issues of racism and nationality, for instance. Our whole sort of political vocabulary was kind of framed by that era.
The teething problems that arose from newly created countries, new borders, and new leaders would persist well into the second half of the 20th century. And around the world, people began the mammoth task of rebuilding their lives. The war that had scourged Asia since 1937 and Europe since 1939 left scores of millions dead, displaced, and homeless.
The Second World War is among the darkest in human history. Approximately 70 million people were killed. Most of them were civilian, and most of them were in Europe. So it really shattered this idea that Europe and the world was going towards something better.
In the Soviet Union, almost 14% of the population lost their lives. In Yugoslavia, it was 10%. Poland, more than 15%. In Germany, it was 6%. In Japan, 5%. Close to 60% of European Jews had been killed.
The main point is the fragility of civilization and the ease with which it can move away. It can go away, and it takes an age to rebuild something. It's very easy to destroy, to pull something down. It's much harder to rebuild it.
Wartime was remembered by many for the queues for hours on end in hope of a scrap of fish or lump of bread. It meant letters from soldiers and the day the letters stopped. It meant living in the dark and seeking shelter in a cellar or tunnel or cave. It meant beggars on the street, blind or limbless, and bullies in colored shirts or starched uniforms marching down the street. It meant losing the king or Kaiser or Tsar. Mostly, it was losing the people we loved and the notion that things would never be the same again. But, looking back, perhaps it was also about the hope of a lasting peace.